Grace and peace to you in the name of Jesus. So make sure you go and tell everybody. You'll never believe what our pastor made us do today. He made us sit and listen to an entire book of the Bible. And next time you hear somebody saying, oh, those Lutherans, they don't pay any attention to the Bible, you remember this. You tell them. Whole book. Beat that one, Baptist. So this whole book that you heard, it's pronounced many different ways, by the way. Every time I ask somebody, how do you pronounce this, I get a completely different pronunciation. So, Philemon? 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 If you look at the Greek, it's almost like filet mignon. Philemon, actually. However you say it, what's the point? Why is it in the Bible? On the face of it, it seems like a bit of a personal issue and a bit of a personnel issue, too. Perhaps it might be of some interest to biblical scholars and historians to get a glimpse at a personal letter from St. Paul to a prominent person leader of the early church. But why, out of all the things, did it make it into our Bible? Only a very small fraction of what was written back in that first century time about Jesus and in response to Jesus, only a very small fraction of it made it into what we know as the New Testament. And sometimes you hear about these other works like there's some grand conspiracy to keep them out of the Bible. Maybe that they're held in secret vaults in the Vatican because the church is afraid of what they say. There's a popular author who's made a lot of money selling books based on that premise. Now, he's a good author, it's a good read, but, it's fiction. So what happened? Why did the books we have in the New Testament, why are they there? Why aren't all the others there? Well, some of it is just that literature was lost over time. It's been 2,000 years, and not all the literature from the time has survived, but much does remain. And as far as I know, what remains is not secret. They aren't hidden in vaults unless I'm being fooled too. You can pick up books that have a lot of these ancient documents in. You can read them. I think I have one in my library. Some of the manuscripts are a bit incomplete, and that's just because over time parts of the manuscripts were lost to time in the elements. Actually, many of these manuscripts were being burned for fire in a monastery before people even realized what they were. Why did we end up with the ones we have? Early in the historical life of the church, in the first 150 years after Jesus, there was a winnowing process to take this whole mountain of literature. Writings have been written about Jesus and in response to Jesus, and to decide which ones had teaching authority. In other words, which ones would be scriptural, which ones would be what we know today as biblical. And so leaders of the early church started asking questions. How do we decide? One of the questions they asked was, is it apostolic? And actually there's two aspects to that question. Is it apostolic in the sense that it was one of the apostles who wrote it, or somebody writing with the authority of an apostle? Did one of them write it? So check if it's apostolic. Throw it in the burn pile if it's not, I guess. And then, is it apostolic in the sense that it teaches, is it in agreement with what the apostles teach? Not everything that bears the name of apostle is in agreement with what the apostles had taught, which has come down to us through the creeds and various teachings of the church. And then finally, does it have something of value to teach the followers of Jesus? If it met all those three criteria, it might, just might. There's still, remember, there's a mountain of literature, only a small number get in. If it met all three of those criteria, it just might make it into what we know today as the Bible. Frankly, most of the literature did not make the cut. And so you wonder, how was it this little letter from Paul to Philemon, how did that make it into what we know as the New Testament today? And so it's only right and fair for us to take a look at that little letter and ask, what does it teach us? Why is it there? What's it teach us? So this little letter is has three characters in there, and I think it actually has four characters, but we're going to start with the three obvious ones. You got Paul. He's the missionary to the Gentiles. He's a writer of the large part of the New Testament. He's a faithful witness to Jesus, whose writings probably did as much to shape the church as we know it as anybody's, except maybe Jesus might be the only person who did more to shape the church as we know it. So you have Paul. Then you have this character named Onesimus. He's a slave who somehow ended up with Paul while Paul was in prison, but who rightfully, according to Roman law, belongs to the third character of the letter, Philemon. Now, Philemon is a friend of Paul. He's a faithful Christian, prominent person in the Colossian church. That's one of the churches in Asia Minor, the area we know as Turkey today, that was founded by Paul himself. And Paul would watch especially over those churches that he founded. If you read that letter carefully, it looks like the church in Colossae actually met in Philemon's house. So he's probably the owner of the place where they meet. So far, so good, except for this. Philemon, besides being a faithful Christian and friend of Paul, also happens to be a slaveholder. And Onesimus is his slave. On top of that, Onesimus, at the time this letter is written, is considered to be an escaped slave, or at least a slave who has overstayed his visa. Perhaps one thought is that he was sent on a mission to go help Philemon's friend Paul out while in prison, and then the time was up and he refused to go back, at least voluntarily refused to go back. And now Paul is caught in the middle of this mess. Roman law is clear. Slaves must be returned to their master. Period. End of report. In fact, anyone not returning a slave could be liable for the value of the slave's work for the number of days that the slave was absent. And that could add up really quickly. This actually was not all that different than the situation in our own nation before the Civil War. In the United States, escaped slaves were required to be returned to their owners even if the escaped slave was in a state where slavery was illegal. In fact, anyone harboring or knowingly helping an escaped slave, even in a free state like New York, could be jailed, fined, or both. Now, with clear legal precedent in place, this letter could have been really brief. Something like this. Dear Philemon, here's your slave. Best wishes, Paul. It's kind of interesting to me that pro-slavery Christians in our own country before the Civil War kind of read this letter like that. They said, see, Paul sent the slave back. The Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. But it actually says a little bit more, doesn't it? It says more than just, here's your slave, have a nice day. Paul makes an appeal on the basis of love, on the basis of himself being a prisoner for Jesus. He says, this slave, this one you used to call useless, he's now not only useful, he's my son in Christ. Back when I worked in MCA Records, Linda knows him, we had a boss who was probably the most insensitive, unpolitically correct person you could ever imagine that would be a boss and still be able to hold a job. Probably wouldn't be able to hold that job nowadays. He would have been sued out of there. But anyway, besides being insensitive, he also couldn't remember anyone's name. So it didn't matter how long you worked for him. He didn't know your name. He didn't have a clue. So a lot of people were who to call it or what to call it. Some people earned certain nicknames, like I earned the nickname Chief. If you wanted me, just yell for Chief. There's a whole story behind that. I'll tell you another time. I don't know, can't remember, Linda, if you had a name. Yeah, you can see how he is pretty insensitive. But anyway, one of our co-workers had the nickname Useless. Where's Useless? That was how he would look for this particular word. So just imagine how demeaning that would be to you if your boss knew of you and referred to you as useless. You can imagine how that would affect your performance and how you would grow into that name. That's what was going on here. The name Onesimus literally means useful one, not useless. The exact opposite means useful one. But apparently, Philemon considered his slave to be the exact opposite of that. And for Paul to have known that, it meant that Onesimus also knew what his owner thought of him as well. It's no wonder he didn't know that. But now there are changed circumstances. Paul writes, receive him back, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother. Welcome him as you would welcome me. If he owes you anything, charge it to me. I will repay. Let's test your biblical knowledge here. I hear echoes of two really famous parables of Jesus here. Welcome him back as a brother. Does this sound like anything to you? Prodigal son. Yeah, doesn't it sound like what the father said to the elder brother? Your brother is home. We have to celebrate. Okay, good. How about this one? Charge it to me. I will repay. Good Samaritan. This is what the Good Samaritan told the innkeeper. So there's a 1-2 punch. And here comes the knockout blow. Paul continues, of course, Philemon, you know that you owe me your own life. There's a zinger. Philemon, you're as much a freed slave as Onesimus should be. In fact, we all are. Are you redeemed in Christ? We say that, don't we? We are the redeemed in Christ. Well, redemption is slave terminology. Redemption was the price paid to free slaves. If we are the redeemed, that means we were the slaves. We are Onesimus. We were slaves to sin, unable to pay the debt that we owe, overstaying our visa and wandering away from God. Here comes the fourth character, the one who's behind the letter, and that's Jesus. Jesus says, I'll pay. I'll pay. You are my brother. You are my sister. Welcome home. We are Onesimus. In many ways, we're also Philemon. He had a choice. He could say, thank you very much, I know my rights. Onesimus, get back to work. Or he could say, welcome home, brother, you're free. We have a choice. We can lord it over one another. We can cling to justice for ourselves, and we can hang on to all of our rights, or we can share the same mercy and grace that we ourselves have received from Jesus.